Next up, our final speaker, Sophal. Sophal is an educator, a researcher, a filmmaker, an inquirer. He's a critic and a challenger of power. From 2002 to 2003, he served the United Nations Development Program in Timor-Leste. In 2006, he received his PhD in political science at the University of California, Berkeley. He's an author, and he wrote and narrated the film of The End/The Beginning, Cambodia, based on his 2009 TED Talk. He's also a consultant for the World Bank, term member of the Council of Foreign Relationships, youth global leader of the World Economic Forum, and holds various other positions and fellowships. He additionally advises the Cambodian Center for Human Rights. So please give him a warm welcome.
Thanks for that introduction. Thank you everybody for joining me today. It's really a huge honor, and I arrived yesterday afternoon. I was able to join dinner and attended the intercultural event. How many of you were there last night? Wasn't it fantastic? Yeah. I mean, I was amazed. Of course, I couldn't stay the whole time because I was so tired, but what I saw was amazing. So anyhow, I'd like to spend this afternoon a few minutes talking about what I mean by challenging power and what I mean in terms of a personal journey. So it's going to be a very personal talk, but first order of business is a word of thanks and a world of thanks, for the one person who has been communicating with me non-stop throughout all this, Aram Sari. And of course the entire organizing team. So You've been amazing since day one, really amazing. And I mean, to be asked to speak about challenging power, to be asked to think about all this UWC style, I mean, what can I say, right? I mean, this challenging power is really waging peace, which you all have been doing here. I know these aren't this year's pictures, but still, right here, and really right now in this very audience. And I'm just amazed. Now this, I don't look that organized. Yeah, UWC Maastricht has been at the vanguard of all this right now. And I mean, of course, I wish the weather were more like this, but it is what it is. Now, a little about yours truly. I think in the intro I was mentioned as an author. I have a couple of books. Aid Dependence in Cambodia, How Foreign Assistance Undermines Democracy. Yes, I'm actually arguing that foreign assistance can undermine democracy. It's one of these things where you challenge power, right? You think about who has the money and who is telling whom what to do. That often ends up meaning that the person who has the least amount of money ends up essentially having to take the orders. It isn't necessarily the government, but it's the people, for example, the people of Cambodia who maybe aren't asked to pay much in taxes because the country gets a lot of aid, but then the government doesn't listen to them even after they're elected. And so that's a problem. It's, I think for those of you who've been to Washington, D.C., the motto of Washington, D.C. is taxation without representation. The argument is no taxation means no representation. I'm not in favor of huge taxes, but still, if you don't tax people and take money from them, you can't ask them, or you don't feel like you can ask them essentially for their opinion. At the same time, it means that you can ask for a lot of corruption from them, which is terrible. The other book, The Hungry Dragon, How China's Resource Quest is Reshaping the World, is about China going throughout the world and taking resources and also making countries do things in favor of their foreign policy. What I teach are courses that are about political economy, about development, and of course I'm trying to explain things like this. Not that it's really necessarily across countries, this isn't the border of a country, not that it's even across provinces, it's sometimes even across the street. So you can have huge differences in development, and how does one justify this, and how does one explain this, and how does one rectify this? And I used to, as was mentioned in the intro, work at the World Bank and at UNDP, and in fact I have an old friend here who was in Timor with me, Jose Bendito. Apparently we met in Timor, and I was at UNDP at the time, and now we're here in Maastricht together, so it's amazing, small world. As a professor, I work on, or I serve on several boards, among them the Nathan Cummings Foundation, which is a Jewish foundation. I mean, you know, a Cambodian guy on a Jewish foundation, as I keep being asked. The International Public Management Network, the Southeast Asia Development Program, Refugees International, Center for Khmer Studies, Partners for Development, and even something like Diagnostic Microbiology Development Program, which whose board I just left after almost a decade. So I'm on the faculty of Occidental College. It's a school in Los Angeles. In the US, of course, college means university. And I joined the faculty in August of 2014, part of their fall collection. You know, I'm modeling for clothes here. And it, you know, it's great. It's been great. By the way, just as a plug, just a side note, I think you'd make incredible undergraduates at Occidental, just like someone else who went to Oxy. Does anybody know who went to Oxy that's really famous?
Obama.
Yeah, right, our former president. And really, I mean, I think it's a testament, and don't we wish really that he were still president? Because just about now, especially because he'd be challenging power, for sure. And of course, there wouldn't be 100,000 revoked visas at about this point, or refugees being banned. So this is where you could be, and the weather's like this most of the year. All right, there was some rain this year, I have to admit. And inside the building where I teach, just to give you a taste of the kinds of resources you have access to, and that's where my office is, right here. So yeah, anyhow. We've got the only UN program for undergrads where you can intern for a semester in New York City as part of a mission, UK mission, for example. One of my students from Pakistan was working with the UK mission. She sat in on meetings, taking notes, reporting back. And you know, every year about 18 students are interns, interns for the UN. So here they are at the World Bank headquarters in Washington, D.C. So Occidental College, just, you know, end of shameless plug for my school. But seriously, you would love it there. Okay, so before Oxy, where was I? I taught at a place called the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. It is a school for junior military officers of the United States, you know, military, Navy, Marines, Army, Air Force, etc., but also military of allies. And they've been busy in Iraq and Afghanistan. They've been busy blowing things up and destroying things. I mean, they're very good at that. But when they came to me, they were responsible for doing something else, which is to do nation building. And what I would tell them every time was that nation building was not like what they'd like me to tell them, which is just give us the A through Z list of how to rebuild a country. We just want to know A, do this, B, do that, and so on. And I tell them it's not like building a house where you essentially have all the rooms and the living room and the kitchen laid out and you just build it, yeah, right? You design it and you build it. That the work that we do in terms of nation building and in terms of international development is a lot more like gardening. Yes, gardening. And gardening is essentially something that changes with the weather, changes with local soil conditions, and you don't know when, you know, you might know when to prune. You'd have to be a local to know that, so that your plants can be better the next season. It's about taking away the illusion of control, and so gardeners have no illusion of control. We create the right growing conditions, nurture a healthy soil life, set up our lifestyle so we have time to tend to our crops, and we plant a diverse variety of sturdy, healthy plants and watch them grow. We adjust as we go along, removing excess weeds, mulching, watering, and fertilizing when necessary, and picking off pests. But ultimately, and this is really important, ultimately the end result almost always includes crop failures and unexpected successes. and we feel more like stewards, sometimes even observers, than masters of our domain. It's something that I think is very humbling. And for the military, of course, they want to know, they want to get it done. They want to, they're go-getter types, type A personality, and it's very difficult for them to lose that control, that illusion of control. And it's so important that we begin with the idea that essentially we don't have control. There's no way that we can have control over a situation like that. Of course, I do this to my plants, so don't listen to me about gardening, right? Caveat emptor there. So I could never have imagined that back in the mid-1990s when I was finishing up undergraduate school, that, and that was 2 years before Harry Potter, by the way, that I'd be where I am today, really. Even here, for example. I mean, it's such a huge honor. It was mentioned that I gave a TED Talk, so I was fortunate enough in 2009 to give a talk about my family's escape from the Khmer Rouge. And it was really the story of my mom's cunning and determination to get our family out of Cambodia, 4 siblings and I out of Cambodia. And at the time I had 6 minutes to tell my story. Today I've got 39 more minutes, so I'll indulge a bit more. But here she is at the end of the talk. My mom is getting a standing ovation soon. They're still seated, but they will get up. And my wife, 8 months pregnant with our first child at the time. And of course, this being TED, they always have somebody, some big names in the audience. So it's really, it was such an honor, but I felt at the time that, she was 73 years old, that there wouldn't be maybe a lot more opportunities to do this with her, to go places, to tell her story, and to thank her really for what she did. And so one of the things that I suspected was, okay, she's getting old on with age, it's going to be harder to do this, to travel together. And little did I know really that 6 months later she passed away. And it was really, I think, a turning point in terms of figuring out what lessons she had in her life that I could learn. Because of course what a mother gives to a child is completely immeasurable, right? I mean, and a father as well, but especially in my case because my mom was so meaningful to me. So I'm going to be giving you a talk about challenging power in 6 acts. The first is Cambodia, second is Vietnam, third is France, fourth is America, and then I'll talk about the world in general, and then returning to Cambodia. So Act 1, Cambodia. Here, my mom and dad in 1969, in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, where I was born, we lived in a house that was quite luxurious. I mean, it's a mansion, really, and it was off of the road to the airport. Today, well, a few years ago, I had the chance, when I was making that movie, The End, Beginning, Cambodia, to go visit that house. It is occupied by about 10 families now, each to a room. Thankfully, it's not a general or a tycoon that took over the house and became, the proprietor of that house. But still, it was very different back then. Phnom Penh was a beautiful city. Movies like The Little Prince, made by the Prince of Cambodia himself, were playing in the movie theaters. But across the world, President Nixon was pointing to Cambodia. And of course, it was during the height of the Vietnam War. What Nixon said of Cambodia was, there are no American combat troops in Cambodia. There are no American combat advisors in Cambodia. There will be no American combat troops or advisors in Cambodia. We will aid Cambodia. Cambodia is the Nixon doctrine in its purest form. And I want to ask you, what do you think he meant by that? What does the Nixon doctrine mean for you? If you're reading this, really, I want it to be a little bit interactive here. So, I'm sorry? Occupation, but not without the actual physical manpower on the ground, right? So, one of the problems was the Ho Chi Minh Trail cut across, Cambodia, and so that's why they needed to get rid of that. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was resupplying the Viet Cong, who were, of course, at war with the Americans. It meant essentially doing this, dropping bombs via B-52s on Cambodia, and bombing Cambodia to the extent that you see here. All the red areas are sites that were bombed, 113,716 sites just between 1965 and 1973. More bombs in terms of tonnage of bomb than fell on Cambodia than World War II Europe, or the equivalent of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Of course, this leads to the downfall of the regime in Cambodia, the Khmer Republic. And on April 17th, 1975, Phnom Penh falls, and this ragtag army of guerrillas called the Khmer Rouge walk into Phnom Penh. And they're young people. They're people really who are like you in the sense of, you know, they're 16, 17-year-olds, DP1s and DP2s, right? Except they've been learning bad ideas about essentially, you know, how evil the city dwellers are, how corrupt they are, and so on. They evacuate 2 million people in 3 days, essentially, my own family included. Were sent all over the country into a mass exodus. And it's the kind of, you know, it's the kind of thing that one can't understand. So here you have the leaders of the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot on the left here, riding a train. It's incomprehensible. The only thing I can relate to you about that experience are the words of Michael Paternity, who wrote about this. He said, "Once upon a time there was a regime so evil that it created an anti-society where torture was currency and music, books, and love were abolished. The regime ruled for 4 years and murdered nearly 2 million of its citizens, a quarter of the population." You know, Stalin said, "The death of one man is a tragedy to the world, but the death of a million is a statistic." This for a lot of people, 2 million people is a statistic. It just is too big of a number. So I want to bring it down a notch. So 1 out of 4 people, right? 1 out of 4 people. Let's just see that. Of course, 1 out of 4 people dies as a result of the Khmer Rouge. And I want to take you to a place where some of this happened. A place called Tuol Sleng, which used to be a school. I mean, imagine the irony. A school turned into a torture center where up to 16,000 people were tortured to death and killed. And this is, you know, behind barbed wires that you can still go down to visit in rooms turned into star chambers, torture chambers on beds in which people were tied using medieval-looking devices. And the Khmer Rouge were very good at one thing at Tuol Sleng, and it was to document who they were torturing because they wanted records of everything. So here you have a mother with an arm reaching up of a child, her child, a baby. These are all people that were tortured to death there. People told to be, made to confess to be both KGB and CIA at the same time, right? Working for the enemies, right? So girls, all ending up in killing fields. So, I mean, this is a very scary time, and I want to take you back now to the story of my own life. So one day in late 1975, so after the Khmer Rouge have taken power, it's almost sunset, and my mother essentially is returning from working in the fields as a forced laborer, a slave really, along with my father, and the Khmer Rouge have called a meeting in which they want to see everyone from the commune to tell them about something. They tell them that their Vietnamese brothers, who are now communists of course, but not yet enemies, are wanting their citizens back. And my mother spoke a little bit of Vietnamese as a child, and so she decided that maybe this is our way out. I don't know if any of you have watched World War Z? World War Z, anybody? Yeah? All right, so there's this scene where Brad Pitt says, in Spanish, he's talking to this family in the apartment. He says, "To move is to live." I think that lesson is absolutely true. To move is to live in a situation like this. So she decided that the only hope, really, I mean, she knew that if we stayed, we'd end up dead. But if we tried to at least have a chance to go to another place, we might have a chance to live. And it took months, but finally they brought trucks to take those who said they were Vietnamese. And so on the 3rd day of our journey towards Vietnam, little did we know then how they would decide who was Vietnamese or not. My father, who was already sick with dysentery and malnourished, passes away. So he actually did not speak Vietnamese, and in a way, his not speaking Vietnamese was a huge problem. Like, how is he going to pretend to be Vietnamese, right? He's not Vietnamese. He's actually ethnic Chinese, speaks Teochew Chow, so he's not going to pass the test. But you know, he passes away, and so there's the problem of what happened to father was not really there anymore. My mom, Act 2 Vietnam, my mom was able to, I mentioned, speak some of that Vietnamese. So she used her ability to speak Vietnamese as a passport, as really language as a way out of Cambodia. And here she is with my 4 siblings and I, but you know, there's going to be 2 tests, and the first one she passes. It's with the Khmer Rouge. It's okay, it's not super advanced or anything, but the second one is with the Vietnamese cadres. And these are the people who actually, you know, really speak the language, who are really the professionals here. And just before that test, Mom discovers, because a lady, Vietnamese auntie, who's also taking the test, tells her, you know, you gave all the boys girls' names and all the girls' boys' names, because she had renamed everybody with Vietnamese names, right, to fit the bill that we're Vietnamese. Well, you've given the wrong gendered names to your children. And so this Vietnamese auntie tells her that and tutors her for 3 days like a drill sergeant, explaining to her, you know, like basically testing her constantly so that she can improve her Vietnamese before the exam. And thankfully, as a result of that help from this, what I call a power challenger, really, somebody who decides to help us, somebody who decides that she's going to take action and take a risk, because after all, she didn't have to do this Vietnamese auntie. She didn't need to go out of her way to help anybody. Everybody's trying to survive, and you know what? Maybe she would get an advantage even by, you know, calling attention to the fact that these people are not Vietnamese and they should be taken away. Well, instead she decides to help, and that's really the power of challenging. So my mother is able to take myself and 4 other kids out. Here we are, safe in Vietnam. She's really frail looking in this picture. I've got this is me, yes. And we had an aunt and uncle there in Vietnam. But life was not easy in Vietnam. Vietnam had become communist by then. And so it was unthinkable that we were going to stay there. My mom was really smart in that she decided right when we got to Vietnam that we were going to say that we were in fact Cambodians, so that we would be able to leave Vietnam. Vietnamese people were not allowed to leave Vietnam. That's why you had the whole boat people situation where they had to get on boats and try to get out via boats. But if you were Cambodian, the Vietnamese didn't really, they had no issue with you leaving, right? I mean, like, of course they wanted money and bribes and so on, the authorities, but at least it was not like you have to stay with us and enjoy the paradise we've created for you under communism, right? So in effect, she's able to then say, okay, we're Cambodians, but now where do we go? The only country that has diplomatic relations with communist Vietnam at that point is France. And so we have to find a way to get to France. And the only way to get to France is if you've got you know, somebody to sponsor you there, because you have to have a relative with the same last name. And so we had asked a cousin who was a starving student in France to help us. But of course he was poor, he didn't have any resources, and he didn't have the same last name, so he couldn't really do much. But one day when he was really, really depressed, he walked around Paris and bumped into a Frenchman, a man by the name of Bernard Guyader, who decides to help for whatever reason. So this French citizen, who did really smoke a lot, decides that he's going to be this power challenger as well. And he decides that he's going to help our family. And he opens a phone book and finds what? Finds a woman with the same last name as my mother, and goes to her and convinces her to sign papers saying that that she's related to her. And she does. Okay, first of all, it's incredible that she does this. The papers get lost in the mail, but Bernard, you know, I guess, forges her name and submits them. And he goes to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, submits this paperwork. I mean, there's this incident that my mom told me where Bernard one day goes at like 5:01 p.m., like a minute after it's closed, but he jumps the fence and goes in and bangs on the table demanding service from the bureaucrats there. And they're like, but we're closed. And he says, no, not by my watch, you're not closed. So he gets the papers through and is able to help us, and we end up in France. Here my sister and I in France, safe and sound. In fact, one of the things that happened to us was we were very fortunate. One day, there was an Air France pilot that went to church against that there are these Cambodian refugee families, and their parents are overwhelmed. In the case of my mother, she's overwhelmed. Would you take some of these Cambodian kids into your family to stay with you? Not to legally adopt us, but to just help the family out and live with them. So I ended up living with one French family, my sister with another. That was the only sad part, that we had to be separated in that sense. But this French family actually lives here now in the Netherlands, in Apeldoorn. So I've been to see them a couple of times since then. But I spent 2 years with this French family, and it was one of the transforming experiences. Maybe I mean I think I speak French today because I lived with that French family and I was able to learn French from them. So 7 years in France total, until my another aunt who lives in the U.S. Contacts us and says, you should move to the U.S. You should be with us. The original plan actually was that we should go to the U.S. Immediately after getting to France. France was never supposed to be a place where we would stay for 7 years. But for whatever reason, my mom was tired of traveling. My sister was sick, and she said, we're going to stay in France. France is a pretty developed country. Of course, for a place like Cambodia, you think of France as the colonial sort of master, so you think of France as the most wonderful place, the most cultured place. But my aunt comes to France in 1985 and convinces us that we should move to the U.S. And this is the actual Pan Am flight ticket that we used to get to the U.S. in October of 1985. So Act 4, America. All right, so America is another interesting story. We end up living essentially in a shack. This is the actual place, courtesy of Google Maps. That little building there back there was the window into my mom's bedroom. And it was not a luxurious. You think of America, the American dream, your successes and so on. Not initially, certainly not. We were desperately poor. Christmases were like this, really, not at all the plenty that America often represents. My mom worked in a sweatshop in Oakland, California's Chinatown, sewing clothes, putting garments together. We lived on food stamps. I mean, if there wasn't a welfare system, I would never have been able to survive. I mean, there was one point where we actually went to a food pantry to get canned foods because we were out. I went to junior high school in Berkeley, California, even though we lived in Oakland, so I used the address of a friend to pretend to live in Berkeley so I could get to better schools. That's how you did it back then. You didn't have the money to go to private school. I did not know about UWC. I probably wouldn't have gotten in anyway. So this was the only opportunity that we had, and Willard was great. I took English as a second language classes because I did not speak English in France, and one of those critical moments in my life that I remember is the time when we had to go from junior high school to high school. So the high school assigned for Berkeley students is Berkeley High School, and in the in the cafeteria, they had these tables set up so that as a junior high school student about to go to high school, you would go there to choose your classes. And the day that I went to choose my classes, I bumped into this young woman who had been tutoring me. She was a Chinese-American young woman, a student, I think, at UC Berkeley. And she essentially told me that she'd been tutoring me, and she told me that I needed to get out of ESL because I had been taking so much ESL already. It was time to get into the normal curriculum. And she said that I needed to do that because the University of California and the Cal State University system, they're looking at things like how many years of normal English did you take? Did you take 4 years? If you didn't take 4 years, you don't qualify for the requirements for the University of California. So if I hadn't met her and she hadn't told me this, I would have just done whatever it said on the paper, take more ESL. So this was the only time ever, a few weeks later, that my mother came to Berkeley High School. Like, I was so surprised. Like, one day I was sitting at a bench and I see her there, and I'm thinking, Mom, what are you doing here? And she had come to sign the papers to get me out of ESL. I mean, it was required that a parent come to get you out of ESL so that you didn't have to take English as a second language anymore. So this Chinese-American young woman was really a tutor and another power challenger, understanding that essentially in order to beat the system, you had to know this information that I did not have. So it's really amazing. I mean, if I hadn't met her that day, that moment in time, who knows if I would have been able to go to college. I probably would have gone to community college and then transferred over, maybe, who knows, right? So in my senior year of high school, and for you, the DP2s out there would know this, or DP1s, which is it, DP2s or DP1s? For the DP2s, okay, I had it right. Right, so as a senior in high school, my high school counselor, this Vietnamese American high school counselor tells me, oh, Sophal, you should go to this, you should go to Berkeley for this meeting at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. And I'm like, okay, why? I don't know why, but you tell me to do that, I'm gonna go there. And there's like 3 other people there, and there's this gentleman there named Bob, who is at that meeting. And Bob he's very interesting. I mean, I don't know who he is. He says he works in admissions. He says, okay, if you have any problems, here's my phone number. He writes it on the application form. And I decide that, okay, well, fine, you give me your phone number, I'm gonna take it back home. I apply to Berkeley, and I get rejected. So this is like a huge disappointment. We're way too poor to be able to go anywhere else. I'd gone into UCLA, but we lived in Oakland. To go to UCLA, I would have had to live in dorms. I would have had to borrow money. I didn't have a driver's license. I didn't have a car. How would I be able to do that? So it was basically going to be, looks like community college for me. I'm going to go 2 years to community college, and I'm going to transfer. But I remembered Bob. I remembered that Bob had written his phone number. So I dug up, another amazing thing, I dug up the application cover that had his phone number handwritten on it. I call Bob up, and I say, hey Bob, do you remember me? You know, we met earlier last year. You told me to call you. It was at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. And he said, okay, yeah, I remember you. Come over. Let's talk about it. So Bob then sits down with me in his office in Sproul Hall, which is the administrative building, and he says, okay, so let's think about the reasons why you could appeal the decision, possibly write a letter of appeal. And we worked together on a letter that he then says, okay, you're going to send it to this woman named Pat Burnett, and this is what you're going to do. And so, amazingly enough, Bob helps me. He's in admissions, I don't know what he does, helps me, and he's a power challenger, helps me to get another letter from Berkeley. This other letter here, which I've scanned for you, says, we have considered your application and have found reason to reverse our original decision and to deny you admission. I mean, this is amazing, right? This is to reverse our original decision to deny you admission. Unbelievable. And I get into Berkeley, and you know what? Bob, a few years later, I read in the newspaper, is named the director of admissions at Berkeley. So he was definitely in the know. I still don't know what he was doing when I first met him or when I went to his office, but he must have been a senior person in admissions. It's just that it didn't matter. You know, he wore Birkenstocks. He was not pretentious in any way. I did not think that he maybe had much power, but obviously he did. And he was able to challenge that power as a result. And so at Berkeley, I have this, you know, it's not all roses, of course. At Berkeley, I had all my difficulties. As a freshman at Berkeley, I was depressed. I've gone from a high school of 3,000 to a school of 30,000. I'm 16 years old at the time, starting college, feeling like I'm not fitting in at all. Of course, relationship problems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I recover, right? You know, after getting the D in organic chemistry and the C in calculus, yes, I'm not perfect, right? I then get A pluses in other classes, so it's an amazing thing. But in my junior year, I walk in the hallway of Barrows Hall, which is where the political science department is. That's my one of 2 majors I'm doing at that time, econ and political science. And I see this poster for something called the Public Policy and International Affairs Program. They have a junior summer institute there, and they've got a postcard, reply postcard to send back for the application form. And all I'm seeing at this point is this junior summer institute for the PPIA is happening in Princeton, New Jersey, and I'm thinking, Princeton, New Jersey, that's on the East Coast. That's maybe not that far from New York City. Yay, I'm gonna, if I do this, I'm gonna be near New York City, right? Who doesn't want to be near New York City and enjoy New York, right? So, but of course, remember, at this point I'm like 19 years old. I still don't drive, and the reality is I'm bluffing because I feel like, I want to apply to this thing, but if I get in, I'm actually not going to do it because there's another junior summer institute and it's in Berkeley, and so I'm just going to apply to both and hopefully I'll get into the Berkeley one and then just stay again at home and everything's comfortable. Well, guess what? Fate would not have it that way. Berkeley's Junior Summer Institute for PPIA rejects me, and I get into Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton for this summer program. And so I have to actually decide at that point, am I going to leave home, go all the way to the East Coast, and live in a dorm, which is what you guys are doing with the borders among you, and actually do all this. And that's just for a summer, and I think I cannot do it. I cannot do it. But there's a woman at the Woodrow Wilson School, the woman whose name is signed on the letter that invites me, who I thought was a man, by the way, because her name was Wardell Robinson Moore, and I had no idea that Wardell was actually a woman's name. But anyhow, I write to Wardell, referring to Mr. or whatever, and Wardell says, for whatever reason, Wardell decides that she's going to convince me that it's okay. I can do it. It'll be great. I'll have a great time. And I decide to take a leap of faith. And so Wardell is yet another, this graduate school administrator and this power challenger who's able to convince this person who doesn't yet believe in himself to do a summer program at Princeton, which then leads to a master's degree the following 2 years when I get into Princeton for my MPA. And so, challenges of power have appeared throughout my life. This room is full of everyday challenges of power. Behind me, in fact, are all the people on whose shoulders I stand. I mean, and really this is a lesson for you. We can all be challenges of power each and every day. To whom much is expected, to whom much is given, much is expected. And that's really the lesson here. I mean, the lesson of responsibility. I mean, you can say to whom, whoever has a lot of privilege should give back, but this is really about the responsibility. So now the world is a funny place. My first job out of Princeton MPA is Master's in Public Affairs, is at the World Bank. The only reason I get it is because I see an email from an alumni of the Woodrow Wilson School who I knew from the year before, who says she needs somebody to be a project assistant for a summer, and they need to do something called knowledge management, which I've no idea what knowledge management is at the time. But I wrote back and said, hey, I'm interested. And you know why I got that job? She remembered that in my first year at Princeton, I had decided to do something for my classmates, which was, I knew how to do web pages. I'd made my own web page, and so I said, I'm going to do a workshop on how to do home pages for my classmates, right? So I said, come meet me in the computer lab on this date at this time, and I'll show you how to make web pages. She remembered that, and she said, you know what? Sophal knows something about making web pages. So knowledge management is a little bit about the internet and so on, and so she decides that, okay, I'm going to be the one that she'll recommend to her boss, Steen Jorgensen, who is a Danish guy. And it ends up being 3 years at the World Bank, where I work on the Maghreb, social protection in the Maghreb, getting to go to Algeria, doing work on Tunisia, and doing just unbelievable stuff. I end up also doing work on Cambodia, poverty reduction on Cambodia, which is like, it's so special to me. I mean, I'm Cambodian. I get to work on Cambodia. A dream come true. And of course, this being the World Bank, I get to ride on the Concorde and enjoy, the caviar and so on. And then subsequently, while doing, more graduate work at Berkeley for my PhD and 2 more masters, I end up at UNDP, where I meet Jose Bendito, right, in Timor-Leste. So this is like, coming full circle, really. The head of UNDP at the time, who used to be a vice president at the World Bank, Mark Malloch Brown, said, There's no more noble endeavor than the fight for social and global justice and for peace and development. I mean, it's a lofty goal, and we know that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights talks about this in its preamble. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in the spirit of brotherhood. But this invokes all kinds of things, like rights, but also responsibilities, things that I taught and also teach now at Occidental, but back then I was teaching it to my junior officers, students, about this idea of the responsibility to protect, right? I'm sure you're all familiar with this idea. This is a norm that is relatively new. It's really there to address the international community's failure to prevent and stop genocides, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, what are known as mass atrocity crimes. We know that when Ban Ki-moon was Secretary General of the UN, he tried to do some of this, but that too often the UN falls short, and that even though we talk about never again, it keeps happening over and over again. I mean, even here in the Netherlands during World War II, right, the Holocaust, 11 to 17 million people died, not just, of course, Jews, 6 million, but also Romas, religious minorities, homosexuals, all killed for being different. And in Rwanda, more recently, we know about the 800,000 to 1 million who died at the hands of the Hutus. It keeps happening, of course. In Bosnia, in the first genocide of Europe since World War II, 200,000 plus images that I still remember. I mean, I remember watching this on television, and you think, you know, this is like a concentration camp, and it's the 1990s. Srebrenica, the anniversary just came up, where 8,000 men and boys were killed. And of course, Darfur, where 300,000 plus have died and are still suffering. So, Act 6, returning to Cambodia. This is the loop that's closing now. I want to show you a picture here. This is Duik, the director of Tuol Sleng, that torture center I talked to you about, the one that used to be a school where 16,000 people were tortured to death. Well, he was found by a journalist in a village. He had since become a born-again Christian, and he was willing to talk about what he did, to even confess to what he did. So that was in 2009. I think in 2010, the verdict came down. He was found guilty in causing the deaths of at least 12,273 people. 12,273 people. Now, he was sentenced to 35 years in prison, reduced to 19 for time already served, and other technicalities because, after all, he had cooperated. But, he wasn't happy with that. And he looks old here, but he's not that old. And if he had served 19 years, he could have walked out alive, right? So he appealed, and the prosecution also appealed because they thought it wasn't long enough. And thankfully, he lost. But it took a year for the new sentence to be read out, which was life in prison. Now, you think about that: 12,273 people, 19 years, then life in prison, right? So that's a huge number of deaths. I know it's been a while since you've probably seen any picture of this man, and maybe you're too young to know who is this? Who is this? Bernie Madoff. You know, that's great because my students would say Dominique Strauss-Kahn. It is Bernie Madoff. Bernie is sentenced currently to 150 years in prison. He technically didn't kill anybody. He's not a murderer. $65 billion in fraud, more like $24 billion in actual losses because he basically told people they had money that they didn't have. So that's not really stealing from them, it's just lying to them. But he did spend real money and cause real money to be lost in the amount of $24 billion. And he's not appealing. He is not appealing his sentence, right? So he accepts 150 years is the right amount for somebody like himself. Now, of course, leave it to Americans to go berserk on these things, but I don't know if you recognize this guy. Who is it? Now, you would be amazing if you know who this guy is. Anybody? A little too hard. He is a little deeper in the woods. He's the guy from Cleveland, Ohio, who kidnapped these women and put them in this house and kept them enslaved for like a decade. His name is Ariel Castro. He was sentenced to 1,000 life plus 1,000 years. You know, that's the Americans for you. And I know, extreme in that sense, right? And you think about it, I am not a monster, he says. He says he's not a monster. He did commit suicide a month later. So, and you think about who is the monster. You think about Bernie Madoff as the monster. You think about Doig as the monster. And I go back to the words of the judge in the Bernie Madoff case, actually a Princeton alum himself, Denny Chin, who noted that 20 or 25 years would have effectively been a life sentence in the case of Madoff. But he reasoned that the symbolism of the longer term, 150 years, was important given the enormity of the crimes. Again, somebody who did not kill anybody but caused losses in the amount of money. One of the people who was on trial at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal is this woman here, Ian Tiret, who was the social affairs minister under the Khmer Rouge. Now, she has, there's a personal connection with her to my father's death. He died in a Khmer Rouge quote-unquote hospital that was flea-infested, bed-bug-ridden, and provided no medical care. So she was in charge of these hospitals. She was personally the minister who was in charge of social affairs. Well, during the trial, she was found to be incompetent. She was diagnosed with Alzheimer's and was released. They did say that if she got better, she could come back to the trial. But obviously she didn't, and she died. She passed away. So justice has never been meted out in her case. Her husband, Ieng Sary, was the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Khmer Rouge. During the trial, he died. So he died at age 87 on March 14th, 2013. This is a man who actually had resources. He had maybe an estimated estate of $5 million. So if he had been found guilty, a judgment could have been placed against him, and then his home could have been taken, things could have been used in terms of compensating victims. Now, the others who remain on trial, who haven't died yet, are Khieu Samphan and Nguyen Chia, brother number 2, who really was a bad character. Khieu Samphan has a PhD from France in economics, found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life. But that's just the first phase. There's more trials going on. They might be found of other crimes as well. So at least there's something there. But even beyond the scope of the tribunal, you think about all of the people who were involved in what happened in Cambodia. I mean, one of the fascinating stories is from a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, Yuk Chang, who has the Documentation Center of Cambodia. His sister was in one of the Khmer Rouge communes. She was accused of stealing some rice and eating it. And so the Khmer Rouge decided that, okay, we're going to find out if you really did steal this rice and eat it. So what did they do? They sliced her belly open to look for the rice. Of course, it kills her. But this is the kind of thing that happened in the Khmer Rouge. And Yuk has become, the head of the center that looks for evidence of Khmer Rouge complicity. All of those photographs, all of those documents in which they talk about what they're going to do, etc., to basically say it's all these people who committed the crime. Now he's obsessed with this stuff. That's all he does. He lives, breathes only the stuff. His mother, who is the mother of the daughter that was killed by the Khmer Rouge, she actually one day receives the guy who was the commune chief, the man in charge of the commune at the time of her daughter's death. And what he does is he's riding a bicycle and he has this chicken in his hand. And he gets to her and he hands her this chicken. And she understands that by doing that, he's accepted that he did something wrong. And she accepts this apology and is fine with it. She no longer has, any issues with wanting to, be obsessed about this, and because she knows he's not going to go to prison, right? So what's going on here is that people have different ways of coping and dealing with tragedy in their lives, with extremely unexplainable things that have happened to them. But that's just to give you a sense of contrast, even within one family, and under the same sort of case of a sister, of a daughter who's been killed by the Khmer Rouge. Now, in terms of what's happening now in Cambodia, this is the Prime Minister of Cambodia. He has been Prime Minister for 32 years. He's a former commander of the Khmer Rouge. He does say that he was part of the good Khmer Rouge, not the bad Khmer Rouge. But this is how I'm getting involved in all this. So I guess I was commenting in a newspaper about Donald Trump being part of the rise of the know-nothings and having some autocratic tendencies and so on. And the Prime Minister of Cambodia endorsed Donald Trump. And so when Donald Trump won, he made a speech at the opening of a Coca-Cola plant in which he said, he, meaning me, wanted to hit my head, his head, the Prime Minister's head, but I missed and just hit Donald Trump's head. And he actually says this. I can't believe the Prime Minister said this. I am not a professor of diplomacy like Sophal, but I have conducted diplomatic affairs for 35 years since I was 26 years old. So I have enough reason to claim that Donald Trump would win. If I were Sophal, I would leave the US immediately. So this is fascinating. It's crazy. I mean, come on, like I have to leave the US, right? I mean, of course, coming from a man who's been Prime Minister for 30 plus years, and it's not been a really amazing tenure, to say the least. Cambodia is the most corrupt country of all the ASEAN members and has been for a number of years. So challenging power as speaking truth to power, as telling it like it is. And in reaction to what the Prime Minister said, I was quoted in the newspaper, and it was tweeted by the public affairs officer of the US Embassy. I had said, as US citizens, we don't become refugees for talking about public figures. Indeed, we're part of a long and celebrated tradition. And that's just simply to say that, in other countries, you end up becoming refugees or you end up dead for speaking about public figures. So really, it's my duty to point this out, to say that there is right and wrong. But not only to the usual suspects, like a prime minister who's been in power for too long. In 2010, for example, I wrote an op-ed in the International Herald Tribune, global edition of the New York Times, titled Khmer Rouge Tribunal versus Karmic Justice. And this was really an opportunity to explain sort of the ideas of like what's wrong with the tribunal. I talked about political interference by the ruling party in the tribunal. I talked about corruption in the tribunal. For example, it was known that people had to pay part of their salary to the figures. And what it did was it earned me the ire of the US ambassador to Cambodia, who wrote to my dean at the US Naval Postgraduate School to have me punished as a result. And when she couldn't get me punished, because obviously there's something called academic freedom, she had me declared persona non grata so that I couldn't go to Cambodia, because I was at the time an employee of the US government, and she, as the US ambassador, was able to say, you cannot be allowed in. And imagine that. I mean, former refugee from Cambodia can't go back to his country because the US ambassador says he cannot go back, which is laughable, frankly. It slowed me down, but once I got to Oxy, it only increased my resolve. So again, to those who much is given, much is expected, and speaking truth to power is the rent I pay for the room I take on earth. And you'll hear that saying when it comes to activism, but that's why every day whenever I'm approached by news outlets to comment about Cambodia, I take that opportunity. I do it for free. I'm not getting paid for it, but I have the privilege of doing that and the opportunity, and I feel like this is the responsibility that I take on myself. So what would Mom think about all this? Mom, who passed away at 73, who was a challenger of power, what would she think? She'd probably think that what goes around comes around, right? So, that the people who had caused us so much harm would eventually meet their own fates. She was Buddhist, so she believed in karmic justice. And in that sense, she probably would have thought that even if in this lifetime, in her lifetime, they didn't face justice, they'd be reborn in the next, perhaps as cockroaches, so that they would face justice eventually. The great wheel of karma would eventually get them. And in that sense, she was able to forgive the fact that there wasn't justice in her lifetime. And I think that for a lot of Cambodians, including perhaps that mother that I talked about whose daughter was killed by the Khmer Rouge and who was handed a chicken, that it's this belief system of Buddhism that allows them to cope with that and not to be perpetually obsessed with it and unable to function, that at least at some level Buddhism and karmic justice have a role to play there. Here's a photo mosaic of my mother who had 7 years of schooling, of formal schooling, and spoke 5 languages and saved lives. The Talmud says that when you save a life, you save the world. And she certainly did, in my case. I mean, I was able to live another day, and my siblings' case. And we had our own children. We've been productive in that sense. 22 lives saved from my mother's actions, and probably more, obviously. My children will have children, and their children will have children. So wherever mom is now, I want to believe that she would be happy. She would be proud of what we've been able to do. My son now is the one that was in my wife's belly at 8 months pregnant at the time. He's now 7 years old. We then had a daughter 2 years later, almost to the day, Caitlin. Then a son 2 years later. It seems to be like this, 2 years at a time. Nathan. And then the latest addition, and that's it, you can't afford it anymore, is Jasmine. Jasmine, yeah, she just turned 2 in December. We're very fortunate, and I think Mom would be very proud of the fact that we've been able to do all this with her incredible cunning and determination. So challenging power almost is also paying it forward, really, paying it forward. So I'm paying it forward by sponsoring some families who've won the green card lottery. So there's this green card lottery, right? And if you win it, it doesn't mean that you automatically, that's it, off to America you go. It turns out that you need to have a sponsor even after you've won the green card lottery, because the US government doesn't want you to just show up and become a ward of the state and dependent on welfare and so on. So they need somebody, and I was introduced a few years ago to this couple. They weren't yet married, but the wife had won the green card lottery, and she had some family in the U.S., but they were poor, and they told her, well, we'll help you, but you have to send us like $20,000 for us to put in the bank account. And I mean, is this money for them to keep? Is this money for them to spend? What is this? So I said, all right, fine. I've got a job. My wife has a job. We'll help you out. We'll sign the papers. We were in other words, like that woman in the phone book who signed and said she was related to my mother, so that we could go to France. So I've done that now for a total of 7 people, technically 6, but they had a child, and so 7 now. And they're trying to make their version of the American dream. They're trying to challenge power in their own way, and I'm trying to challenge power in my own way. And it's really about that first law of karma. Cause others to have good results so you can too. So here they are, the first family that I helped bring, and then subsequently this family of 4 that came to the United States. And it's really by continuing to speak out for refugees, really the most vulnerable people in our society, the most vulnerable human beings, since I'm one myself, that, and I feel the outrage of it all. To pick on refugees is to pick on the people who have the least power possible. They're the ones who are running away, not voluntarily, but because they have to. They don't have any desire to leave their country. They want to stay in their country. They want to stay in their homes, but they can't anymore. And to essentially have them leave, to accept them to the United States, and then to say, I'm sorry, you're no longer allowed to come in, is such an outrage. It's crushing their hopes after you've given them visas. It's unbelievable, and that's certainly what I try to do as a board member of Refugees International. In the very little way that I can, tweeting out their messages and so on, and retweeting them and sharing them with other places, and to continue to speak whenever I can for those who can't speak. People in Cambodia who, if they said what I said, they would be in big trouble. The truth is, people die. People are killed every few years. It's like a regular occurrence. The latest one was July of 2016. Kem Lay murdered at a coffee shop at a gas station. The guy who allegedly shot him spoke on television and said his name was Meat Kill. Literally said his name was Meat Kill in Khmer, which is unbelievable. I mean, that's like sending a message to people and saying, if you do anything more like speaking, criticizing, or anything like that, you will be dead. And so I try to continue doing that work each and every day whenever I'm asked to. So so you'll see that in Google News. Okay, final pitch. I really think you'd be a wonderful group at Oxy, and regardless of what you do, stay in touch and keep challenging power wherever you are, wherever you go. And I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you. I was told UWC audiences are very critical. I hope that doesn't mean cynical. So just, take it easy, right?
Well, first of all, thank you for being here. I found this very inspiring, honestly. I'm Valeria, I'm from Mexico, and my question is, in the face of what's going on right now in the world, not only in the United States, but right now for me it's really important what's going on in the US, of course. How do you think we can be power challengers despite the fact that everything that we do apparently holds us back in terms of our expression? Like, for example, yesterday I found out that when you go to the United States, my family told me that the border is checking out your phone, and if you have Trump memes or anything that is against the president, they take away your visa. How do you think?
Wow.
Yeah. So like even our freedom of expression is being held back. How do you think we can challenge that power?
Wow. Well, I feel that what's happening with our relationship to Mexico is obviously counterproductive. It's crazy. We're physically attached to Mexico. There's no way we can be, not neighbors with Mexico, right? So you want to have good relations with Mexico, and to build walls instead of bridges is crazy. In your case, what you're asking me is how do we subvert? How do we challenge without being knocked to the ground, or even despite being knocked to the ground? And look, it's the story of every movement, right? The movement where you take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So right now we're in the step backwards, right? We're taking a step back, but you've got to think about it in terms of the long game. It's certainly not the case that he'll be president forever. It is a huge step back in terms of our relationship, and as I see it, obviously, the better angels of American society will realize all this. You've got to write about this. So what you've learned now from your family that I had no idea about ought to be made as public as possible. Now, you could do it anonymously if you want to protect your identity. Open a Twitter account with Hillary Trump as the handle. But you just do whatever it is you can to bring light to the dark places, to bring justice to the places that have injustice, and to try to be a voice for those who can't speak. So from where you are at this point, obviously you're you're able to say a few things, but you don't want to necessarily attach your name to it because that would be personally, dangerous for you. So keep speaking and keep challenging. And I know it's hard. I know it's a price to pay. Look, I'm paying the price, right? I don't think it's wise for me to go to Cambodia right now at this particular moment, given what's happened. But there's no way that I'm going to trade. I'm going to say, okay, in order to go to Cambodia, I'm going to shut up and not say anything anymore. I'm just going to turn a blind eye, do the three monkeys thing, hear nothing, see nothing, speak nothing, right? So you do the opposite. You see and you speak and you hear and you continue that. All right? Thank you, Valerie. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Luana, I'm from Brazil. And I wanted to ask, what's being done right now in terms of truth and reconciliation in Cambodia? And if so, do people accept the reconciliation? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luana. So the only thing that's happening officially is the tribunal. And if you think about a tribunal, it's quite the opposite of truth and reconciliation, right? What happens in a trial? In a trial, your incentive as the accused is to deny that you had any involvement in whatever is happening. So you want to say, I had nothing to do with it, I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, when it's obvious that you obviously had something to do with this, but then you say, okay, well, they made me do it. If I didn't do it, they would kill me, right? So then it becomes like, okay, it's somebody else who actually wanted me to do this, and I'm just trying to survive. That's exactly what Duik argued. That's what others have argued. It's always Pol Pot did it. Well, he's dead. So now, you're just pointing to a dead person saying that they made you do it. Otherwise, you'd be killed. So that process of the tribunal is not very conducive to the idea of like telling truth. It's not like, oh, come and tell us everything you know, so that we can essentially say that you don't have to go to prison anymore because you have told us the truth. That's what happened. That's more like what happened in South Africa. Of course, what happened in South Africa is portrayed as this huge success, and it had some successes and it had some failures, but it hasn't really happened quite that way since, because people, there are structures of power that make it very difficult. And you think about the tribunal in Cambodia, you had at one point 5 people, now 2 of whom are dead, so 3, who essentially were on trial, have been found guilty, and the total cost has been $200 million for that. And you think about, what could you do with $200 million in terms of making people's lives better, as opposed to, conducting a process, which, of course, it's a process. It's got to have lawyers, it's got to have defense for the accused, and so on and so forth. But at some point, I think there were people who said, we should just send a postcard to every Cambodian and say, guilty or not guilty, and just mail it back in, and but of course, that's not how justice is done, right? So it's hard. Cambodia does not have a resolve on things. You have a situation in which a lot of government officials, senior government officials, are former Khmer Rouge. You have, mid-level and some senior level Khmer Rouge still walking around. You get the former head of the Khmer Rouge Navy who's walking around free, and he's being talked about as a potential other person on the tribunal, but the government has said, that's it, we're not allowing any more people to be put on trial. And so the scope of justice will be what it is, and until there is somebody else who thinks differently and who does differently. But I know it's not satisfying. And I don't think that we're going to have a resolution to that for at least a while. And remember, it happened in the 70s, right? So people are still alive, but they're dying now, and they've been dying. And so it's going to get harder and harder as time passes to really bring that measure of light, not even justice, but of light to the situation. Thank you.
Thank you.
On a different note, I understand that you're also a filmmaker. I think that's a bit weird considering you're someone from the academia. So I would like us maybe to explore that connection, how that happened, maybe explain us how did that happen and why did you do it?
Right. Well, it shouldn't be weird. I mean, I think academics would do well to make more films and to communicate in ways that are less esoteric and difficult to penetrate, frankly. I mean, I think one of the things that's sad about academia is that you become more and more sort of expert, and then you can't talk to anybody anymore because you use language that is incomprehensible to normal people and only barely comprehensible to your colleagues. And in a way, the whole review process for journal articles is based on, well, if I can't tell what the hell this guy's talking about, maybe he does have something that is like smart to say, I don't know, so I'll just let it go as a result. I'll just let it pass through it. The filmmaking process, all right, so just to be clear, I'm not the director of a movie, I've never done that or anything like that, but from the very beginning, even before my TED Talk, there have been people who I've met throughout my years after college that were filmmakers, and they were interested and they wanted to do something about Cambodia. So I think the first movie in which I appeared, the documentary, was Fragile Hopes in Cambodia after the killing fields. And I'm just telling the story there about what happened to our family. And then, of course, the TED Talk in 2009 happened, and so it's been watched 440,000 times or something. So somebody early on saw it from Singapore, and she wanted to make a documentary about it to be broadcast on Channel News Asia in Singapore and throughout Asia. And so that became the End Beginning Cambodia, one of 2 episodes for a series for her. And so I was very fortunate. So we went, by then my mom had passed away, so how could we introduce her voice in there without actually having her, because she was dead. The only way was that I had done this article in the New York Times with my mother, and I had recorded her voice on an audio recorder, and it was these micro cassettes, right? And I still had those, and it wasn't done for professional quality audio or anything like that. So I said, I have these tapes of my mother, and now we're gonna transcribe everything that's on there, and we're gonna put them into the documentary. And that ended up being the documentary, and it was based on this, the eulogy I read at her funeral, which was a letter to her grandchildren about what she did to make their lives possible. And so, what a tribute, I mean, to be able to explain what she did, and it's really directed at the grandkids, but except that a wider community of people have now had the pleasure and the opportunity to see this documentary and to be able to enjoy it and to be able to draw their own lessons from it and to understand the importance. I mean, when I've screened it at various venues, it's been weird. I mean, there was like this one time I was at this conference, and the guy, it's like 10 people in the room, and the movie is over, and then this guy rushes out of the room, and I'm thinking, oh geez, I guess he didn't like it. He needs to go somewhere else. Then I see him later in the day, and I say, oh, what was wrong? Why did you leave? And he said he had to call his mother immediately to thank her for what she did for him. So it moved him. It moved him so much that he was in tears. So I think making movies is about translating some of these ideas and making them comprehensible, making them visual, and I'm certainly not an actor. I was given some lines to memorize for the documentary, and I would keep screwing it up every time because I'm not. I just don't repeat stuff correctly, right? I repeat it my own way. And then more recently there've been Adam Ruins Everything is like a series in the U.S. about dispelling myths and so on, and so I somehow ended up on there doing a cameo about, of all things, about like clothes drives and foreign aid and Tom's shoes, how that's not what you think it is, because it's a for-profit operation, and people who need shoes probably don't need shoes given to them from somewhere else. They need to have shoes made in the country where they live so that jobs can be created, as opposed to giving away stuff to people. Just basic ideas. So, thank you.
Hello, my name is Stefano, I come from Italy, and I have a question about your story. During all the story you mentioned some power challengers, and for example one of them was this lady that helped your mother pass the test to go to Vietnam, and probably like she did so, and she also risked herself by doing so. While another power challenger, it was your mentor, your teacher that bumped like almost randomly to you and gave you an advice. So like I want to ask you, do you think there's a difference between the two, or they're both equally power challengers?
Well, Stefano, thank you for that. Look, I don't want to say, okay, this is a minor power challenger, this is a major power challenger, but of course, if you take more time and more risk for what you do, you should be recognized for it. I mean, the Vietnamese auntie who did this took incredible risk, right? I mean, she was essentially conspiring with my mother to help her, and spent days drilling her so that she could pass a test. And then, when we left Vietnam for France, my mom found her, and we went, and she went to her and thanked her and gave her some money to show our appreciation for what she did. So obviously, that's so much more of a risk to go out there and to take than the tutor who just bumps into me. But what I want to say from that is, the lesson from that is that it could be something as small as, oh hey, I have some advice for you. Can I take a look at your schedule? Oh, wow, you're taking ESL? Why are you taking ESL? You want to go to college? Oh, well, if you want to go to college, you need to have more regular English courses. Of course, it killed me when I started taking regular English courses. I did not know what an essay was or what a thesis was. But she took that little. She didn't have to. She could have just said, oh, Sophal, whatever. I mean, I got somebody else to talk to. I mean, a lot of it is luck. A lot of it is this incredible little gestures that can mean a difference. I'm not saying that, if I hadn't met her, for sure I would be nowhere, whatever. But still, it's you think back to the people who've made a difference. Like yesterday, I asked some of you during dinner time, like, who helped you to understand, to find out about UWC? And some people said, their parents. Some people said their school principal. Some people said, their friend, somebody else who had gone to school earlier to your UWC. I mean, these are the kinds of people that I want to say are power challengers, because they were willing to make an extra effort and to do a little bit of something that then led to you. Maybe if they hadn't done that, who knows where you'd be? I mean, maybe you wouldn't be here today at UWC Maastricht, right? So just recognizing that and understanding that there are power challengers, big and small, and they don't have to come in the shape of a Martin Luther King, for example. They can come in the shape of just a person who you meet in an everyday situation. Yes.
Hello, my name is Alexander. I come from Bulgaria. Firstly, thank you for being here again. And where I come from, the phenomenon of brain drain is pretty significant, and population decrease is a pretty big problem. And listening to your story, I kind of got that notion of you still have that either subconscious or conscious desire for prosperity of your homeland, of Cambodia. And so my question is, considering where I come from as well, my question is, to what extent is it feasible to challenge power and to have an influence on your homeland, being outside of your homeland, without facing any kind of judgment, skepticism, and blocking your actions? Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you. That is a question that is constantly on the minds of Cambodians, expatriates and non-expats. The first time I went back to Cambodia in 1996, after leaving in '76, I was told that there's this word that local Cambodians use to describe Cambodians who come back from overseas. The word is a nikajun, which is like Khmer foreigner, but it has a negative connotation. And I was waiting for that word to be used during my stay there, and it got used one day. It was in fact in front of Tul Slang. It was a little boy who was selling some food there, and then he decides to call it, like, I didn't buy anything from him, all right? So then he says, oh, Khmer nikajun, or whatever, like as an insult, and I was so outraged. But the truth is, there's always going to be that, all right? So there's always going to be the question of legitimacy from the standpoint of those who did not leave, those who have stayed, to say, well, you know, this person is coming from the outside. You know, they don't know what we have to go through on the inside, what we're dealing with. And obviously I don't. And the whole lesson is that locals know best. I'm still coming from the outside, from the standpoint of like, I did not, you know, I didn't spend all my life there. I don't know intimately. But at the same time, look at the other lesson I pointed out, which is that being at the outside, I get the privilege and responsibility to speak because those who are on the inside cannot speak, right? So there's this problem of like, okay, you're on the inside and you have the lived experience of somebody local, but then can you actually say what's on your mind? Because if you did, you might end up dead. So then I have to take that responsibility of being the person who's like more unafraid to speak up, because after all, you know, I'm just less at risk, frankly. So it's always going to be there, you know, every country. But the truth is, never, you know, when you go to Bulgaria, for example, you know, don't act like you know it all and you have all the answers, and you know, that's just the wrong way to approach any situation. And so, you know, to be humble and to try as much as possible to listen, and to not be in a situation where you're dictating anything, because you're not, and you don't have all the answers. That's just the first step of any good relationship that begins, and it applies even to if you weren't Bulgarian and you're going to, you know, to another country just trying to help in that situation. You know, you don't have all the answers. You're trying to learn.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Samar, and I come from Georgia. First of all, thank you for the amazing and truly inspiring speech. And seeing all the stages, all the different acts in your life, I couldn't help but wonder if there was another act coming up, something big, something major, an initiative coming from you that UWC students could possibly collaborate with.
Wow. Oh God. Now you've set up expectations. Look, right now I'm in the act of being a dad to my 4 kids, and of course of living in the moment and staying out of, as much as possible, out of physical trouble, danger, if at all possible. For I do want to see my kids live, you know, through all the things that parents want to see. Your kids should grow up and go to school and, you know, have a family and so on. You know, I am certainly, so like the phase of my life where I'm wearing the academic hat is there, but I'm realizing, of course, that it's not enough to just write articles and books, right? To write articles and books, and even to make movies or to be involved in movies, it's good and it advances my career, and I want to continue doing that. But I think there's room, certainly, in continuing the work that I do on the boards of various organizations. So, you know, I think that, you know, as UWC students, I'm sure you want to be involved more with organizations that do incredible work, that advocate for refugees, that work on development, that try to, defend those who have the least in society. And so I would just encourage you to stay in touch with me, and maybe there are things that we can connect on and work together on. I mean, look, I'm always looking for people who might be inspired and want to do something, whether it be in terms of, you know, working with me collaboratively on research, or working with me on maybe creating a project that tries to, you know, do some of the work we've talked about, you know. So, you know, in Cambodia, there's a school that I and a couple of dozen other people helped fund in the memory of a friend of ours who was assassinated in 2003, Rhapsody. And there's a library there. We've created, there's books there. So if you're ever in Cambodia, you might want to, you know, check out the school, maybe bring some books to it to build up the library, and to, you know, we've got to brainstorm. But I'm not at the point where I'm going to announce some huge sort of project that I don't even have in my head yet. So unfortunately, it's anticlimactic. But there's not actually like, oh, I'm about to announce this thing and now you've just given me the opening for it to do that. So, but there's always stuff happening and I'm always happy to do that. There was one young man here and then Jose to you after that. So, yeah. Oh, okay, go ahead and eventually we've got to get to him.
Hey, my name is Lasse, I come from Norway. Earlier in your presentation you said that foreign aid undermines democracy. I was wondering if you could explore that a bit further.
Sure, and there, look, I'll tell you. So the relationship is basically one of, all right, so people in your normal country, that people pay taxes, and then they vote. Let's say if it's a democracy, right, they vote. And so part of the expectation is accountability. I voted for you and I paid my taxes and I expect you to deliver services for me as a citizen. And what I argue is that aid comes in and disrupts that relationship by saying to the leaders of the country, oh, well, you know, you don't really have to collect as much in tax revenue. You could maybe officially collect a lower amount, take the foreign aid as the sort of the substitute for that tax revenue. And then because of that, you don't have to listen to your people as much because they're not paying officially as much in taxes. They're not paying your salary or whatever. You don't feel like you owe them that. And then on top of that, you get to engage in a lot of corruption, which then says, oh, because you didn't pay so much in taxes, now we want money under the table. And as a result, you know, all of the things that happen due to corruption are made worse. So you have monopolies that build up, you have concessions that are given, things that would normally not happen in a society that you know, values antitrust and says, wait, you know, why should you have one phone company only, one mobile phone company? Because one of the incredible things is in the mid-90s, there was a company that was created in Cambodia, a cell phone company, and it had so it's a Swedish company. So you know, this is like the West, right? The West comes to Cambodia and says, we want to create a cell phone company, and we have something new for you. This is not even a technology. It's prepaid calling. So instead of postpaid calling, you will have your customers buy cards and add money into your phone. And so this is at a time when it was all postpaid in Cambodia, and they had trouble collecting the money from these generals who, you know, you come for the payment and they shoot in the air and you're not going to get your money, right? So postpaid calling was huge. And so what this company did, I won't name it because I don't want to get in trouble with the company, but what this company did was they got from the government, they gave the government like $1 million in cash in a suitcase, and then because I know it because the guy who did it told me. He said he brought a suitcase with money in it and gave it to the officials, and what they got was a patent from the Cambodian government for the idea of prepaid calling, and they were told, we will protect this idea from competition for 6 months so that you can have the only prepaid calling service in Cambodia for 6 months. Now, you know how phone numbers work. Once you get a phone number, you don't want to change phone numbers, okay? So you want to stay with the same phone number, you want to stay within the same network if possible, and all these network effects that are the result of that unfair advantage at the beginning. And of course, that company became gigantic as a result in Cambodia, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, you know, just the leader for many years as a result, and charging much more than other companies, and having all that unfair advantage. And why? Because, you know, they had this sweetheart deal through corruption and joint ventures and so on. So, yeah, I think your turn finally.
Yeah, I'm Basit from Afghanistan, and I would like to first thank you for your speech. I particularly found your story inspiring because I could relate to it. My family left Afghanistan during the Taliban regime and fled to Pakistan because my family thought that to move was to live. So Afghanistan is a country where the current leaders are usually, like most of them are warlords who fought against the Russians in the late 20th century. And young people, despite their constant perseverance, do not find any voice in the government and do not find any place in positions of authority. So what would you suggest, I would really appreciate your opinion as to how young people should persevere and challenge power in such a circumstance. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And look, Afghanistan is even more corrupt than Cambodia. So my regrets to you for the challenges you face. But your president is a former World Bank guy, right? And I think that generally speaking, well, before he became a politician, he was a very reasonable person in terms of his ideas. And he may still, I think, generally be that same person, except that he's a politician now, so he has to make all these compromises and so on. But the honest truth is that in some ways, having that is still a huge advantage over somebody who's been in power for decades and won't let go, right? So there's that, and if you wanted to, you could possibly challenge power in ways that could be maybe certainly not accommodating to the warlords, but accommodating to promotion of a rational legal framework in Afghanistan. So one of the collaborators of your president, Claire Lockhart, wrote a book with him called Fixing Failed States. And I know Claire, she's a fellow young global leader of the World Economic Forum. There are ways that I think you can make a difference in the case of Afghanistan in this particular circumstance that would be beneficial without selling your soul. In other words, if somebody in Cambodia says they want to, they just came out of university and they say they want to join the government, I have to question that, because it's almost like saying you want to join the government to make, I don't know, $100 a month when you know you need at least $1,000 a month to live. So how are you, unless you're independently wealthy and all it is you want to do is, just not take the salary and just be part of the government, that's one thing. I just don't think most people are like that. And what I observe of their actions tends to be they join and they become essentially tools of loyalty and fiefdoms, and then they start saying things that are incredible. I mean, writing letters to the newspapers criticizing the opposition in ways that this guy he used to work at the Documentation Center of Cambodia, one of the staffers, and now he's part of the government, and he's writing incredible letters that are clearly partisan, but that's his job. Once you join that side, you join that side. Now, but is there a way that you could actually be helpful to the development process of your country without becoming a cog in the wheel and having to marry somebody's daughter and something and becoming part of the system? In other words, I think there is. Sure. Jose, you got. Yeah.
Well, I want to finish. I want to just answer. That was a very good question. So what can you do? I think being here, you are already doing things. Organizing this type of event, you are doing a lot. My question to you would be, keep doing it. Keep doing it and keep expanding it, not only to UWC people. Okay? We actually met in East Timor. I happened to end up working in Cambodia also. And now we met again. The world is becoming very, very small. And what we need is people like you, who at this age is already thinking about this. But not only in UWC. I mean, we need it in almost every high school. So use the network that you have around the world to tap into more. I mean, try to convince other UWC to do this type of events and to do it with high schools around you. Okay? Because then you will create a network of young people who are very sensitive to these things. And one of you will find that can help, Sophal in one thing, and another will help another person. But there will be a young generation very sensitized to these type of things. But only 17 schools around the world are not going to help. But through your schools, you can help many other schools. And I think that's what you need to think about.
I couldn't say it better. Thank you.
Oh, does it work? I'm very sorry, but time is running out, so I'm going to take the liberty of asking the last question.
Okay, because I can keep going, you know. I can just plow right through.
Okay, Dion, if you ask a question briefly, or...
Hello, I'm Dion from Indonesia. I'm coming from a country which is like the condition is like many groups like to challenge the power between there is this division between the power challenger and the authority. But the very problem is there are many groups which challenge power, but they don't challenge the power wisely, which means that the government did good things, but they still challenge the power, and it makes the turmoil in the government itself. So I would like to ask, to what extent should one challenge power? And the second one is how to challenge the power challenger, which is not wise. Thank you.
Yeah, very powerful question there that I if I had an easy answer to that, I could tell you, and then everything would be resolved in the sense of we would know when to challenge and when not to challenge and so on. But here's the thing. All right, so of course it's in the eye of the beholder. A lot of this is dependent on the person who decides whether to act or not. And there are of course situations where, in my view, the people who are challenging are maybe doing it out of line. They don't have all the information, and they're being encouraged by other people to challenge behind them that they don't realize are actually manipulating them and so on. It's hard. I mean, it's not easy to be able to tell you exactly how to go about things. I mean, in Cambodia, there are people who are determined to take up a violent struggle there, who believe that they need to create an alternative government, a government outside of Cambodia and so on. And I've not taken part in all of that. I think for me, that's like the time for violence is, Cambodia has seen too much violence, right? But it's hard. I mean, in your country, Indonesia, you have a president Jokowi, who came, it seems that the whole narrative, if one is to believe it, came from the lowest possible sort of circumstances to rise to the presidency. And so there was a lot of hope there. And of course people, some might be unhappy with this or that or his policies and so on. It's hard to decide when is the time to challenge, when is the time to accommodate. One of the things I do want to say though is that, there is in your heart, I think, what's right and wrong. You know what's black and white. And for so much of what I see out there, it's a game that people play. People like to try to say, no, this white thing here is actually black, and this black thing is actually white. And it's a Cambodian saying. I'm sorry, I'm using it on you, but it's basically a way of saying that sometimes you get into situations where in order to be part of the system, you have to accept things that are not true. And I really think that's where I draw the line. For a lot of Cambodians, participating in that system means essentially saying, I now will change my reality. I will no longer say what is true. I will say only what it is you want me to say. And I think that's when you've lost your conscience, your integrity, your ability to speak independently, and it's too much. Of course, there are those who simply turn a blind eye. They're not going to see what's going on. They know what's going on in their hearts, but they're not going to see what's going on, and they're not going to speak up about it. That's more like accommodating power. There are those who pretend that they're going to support reform or they want to discuss reform, but in fact they're not interested in reform at all. What they're interested in is listening to your telling them about reform, pretending that they're interested in reform, and then they're going to twist the reform to do the opposite of what the reform is supposed to do so that it can advantage them. And it's so sad because you see that happening all the time, like land titling in Cambodia, which is a good idea, give people land titles, but guess what? If you give the wrong people the land titles, then they're going to take the land from the people who actually had the land, who are the true owners of that land. And so you basically use the law to take away something from somebody. And so that's, again, like so many of the previous answers I've given, there isn't a clear-cut sort of like, okay, this is what you do, follow A to Z. Remember the gardening metaphor. You know, you just have to, you can't have that illusion of control. You need to realize that the answers are not there, but you do need to have a compass in you. You might change your methods, but you can't change your principles, and your principles are, you know what's right, you know what's wrong. Stick to that. It's just the methods might be different as to how to get there, but don't lose your compass through all of this.
So you may or may not be aware of this. Like, I gather you've done very extensive research before coming here about UWC and ICC. But last year in the closing ceremony, we had Sophia Högster as a speaker, and she interned as a defender for Brother 2 at the tribunal in Cambodia. Given the war tribunal in Cambodia, could you brush upon how this has impacted your view of international criminal courts, and in hindsight, whether you believe the ends justify the means?
Right. Okay. Well, I was not aware of that brother number 2 connection. It's almost ironic because I am a civil party to the case that led to brother number 2's conviction. Right. So I'm one of the victims of brother number 2, having lost my father, having lost a brother that's gone missing, and I don't know where he is since '75. So, okay. So your question is essentially, I'm sorry. Just repeat that.
Yeah. If you could brush upon like how the war tribunal in Cambodia has impacted your view of international criminal courts.
Okay, all right.
Like in hindsight, whether you believe the means or the ends of the tribunal, the outcome justified the means, the expenditure, etc.
Right. Okay. So I actually think that I'm going to give a bit of a controversial answer in that op-ed that I wrote in 2010, criticizing the tribunal. I was criticizing it because it seemed to me that it was allowing itself to become politicized. It was clear that the authorities had said, you know, 5 is the magic number. You will not be allowed to try more than 5 people, and then 2 die. So what happens, right? I mean, to impose that kind of limit on a mass atrocity that led to 1.7 million dead people doesn't seem to me to be rational, because that's like saying 5 people did everything. You will only find these 5, you can only put them on trial, these 5 individuals, and I think that's incredible. So the scope of the trial has been way too limited. Is it perfect by any means? No. Look, the head of the victims support section, when I joined, was this woman named Kit Bhopal. She's a human rights defender, and then I said, okay, I'll include my name among victims because she is somebody that I like, that I believe in. And then a few months later, she was forced out, and the person who replaced her was this woman from Australia who has a Cambodian passport, who is known to be a Trotskyite. And I'm like, why would you put somebody like that to represent the victims of the tribunal? It's an insult. But you know, this is the machinery of an organization, of a bureaucracy that basically said, oh, well, we think she can deliver the job. And I was, of course, despondent over that fact. So do I think that it did a great job? Absolutely not. Do I think that, you know, you think about Nuremberg. Nuremberg ended up doing, you know, dozens, possibly even hundreds of cases in the matter of months. It was finished, as opposed to, you know, this tribunal that's dragged on for years and years and years and ultimately has only done 3 people. There's always a price to pay for all of these things, and the price, of course, is that you know, you're trying to achieve certain goals. So you're trying to do norm penetration, showing Cambodians how to conduct trials that are fair. All right, if the Cambodians did anything to this tribunal, it was to penetrate the tribunal with their own norms, which is corruption and you know, twisting the motives and motivations of the tribunal. So it's almost like it's laughable. Like if the goal was, oh, we'll show them how to do trials properly. They showed the Westerners essentially how it's done in Cambodia through this through this tribunal. And I've been very critical in that, you know, we have people, yeah, we have a lot of people who, you know, want to be human rights defenders, who become lawyers, who go into international law and so on. And sometimes I have to say, I am a bit cynical about them, because it's like they go to one tribunal, they'll go to Timor-Leste, and then they'll go to this, and then it'll be like, okay, we'll add more tribunal to our CVs, and then it's like, and what happens in the end? You know, you've spent years and years doing work on this and that, and we, the victims, are still unable to find justice, and so it's sad. But look, I'm not blaming any particular individual. It's just that the system is created in such a way that you end up incentivizing this sort of accumulation of the, you know, I'm in so many tribunals, I did Rwanda, I did this, I did that, and of course it's the usual suspects. One has to look at, you know, who ends up in these kinds of tribunals in those positions. They're not typically people from the south, they're people from the north, and so it is a kind of, you know, unfairness and continuation of sort of policies and tendencies that you know should be changed. There should be more diversity there. Approaches should be different, and so I don't know. I've droned on and on. I'm sure she was great last year in closing, and I'm giving a slightly different view this time with my own situation. So that's really it. Thank you. I'll be here until 5 a.m. tomorrow, 6 a.m. tomorrow. Yes, the guest house. I did not go to a hotel. Yeah. So I'll probably eat dinner with you all tonight.